Today's video is brought to you by Trade Coffee. Almost every pour-over guide out there is actually teaching you the wrong things. You see, pour-over is one of the most controllable brew methods that there is, but all of the content out there focuses on recipes. And recipes are basically like a snapshot in time. They worked really well on somebody else's pour-over dripper, the specific coffee that they were using, and there are actually zero guarantees that any of that is going to translate to your setup at home. The good news is you don't need to go out and buy any new gear. You don't need a new pour-over dripper or to go out and find a different recipe. And by the end of this video, you'll be able to sit down with whatever brewer you have at home, with whatever coffee you have at home, and just dial it in. No complicated recipe required. Now, to get to that, we need to start with one idea, and that is that the water you're using is actually acting as a solvent when you're brewing pour-over. When it hits the ground coffee, it starts pulling out different compounds, and how it does that has an impact on the actual flavor of your finished cup of coffee. And this always happens in the same order. The more sour or acidic compounds come out first, the sweet balanced stuff comes out in the middle, and the more bitter or sometimes harsher compounds come out towards the end. This is true for any brew method, espresso, French press, or pour over, and it's called the process of extraction. And what's really unique to pour over is how much control you actually have over that process. Pour over has 5 distinct levers that you can pull to change your cup of coffee. And in my experience, people tend to really focus on 1 or 2 levers at the most, or sometimes even none if you're just following a recipe that you found on the internet. Now, what's really cool with pour over is those levers don't just move that extraction number up and down. Each one actually shapes the result that you get in the cup differently. But before we get to any of that, we do need a baseline to start from. So I have 15 grams of ground coffee here, and I'm going to use 240 mils of hot water heated to about 91 degrees Celsius. Now that's a 1:16 ratio. And before you start thinking of this as a recipe to follow, just know that we're going to look at it through the lens of those levers afterwards. This is just how we're getting started. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start my timer, and then I'm going to pour a small amount of water onto my ground coffee. And this is called a bloom. I'm going to use between 2 and 3 times the amount of water as the amount of ground coffee that I started with. For this coffee, I'm using a 50-gram bloom, and I'm going to let it sit for about 45 seconds. Then I'm just going to take the remaining amount of water that I want to get up to, about 190 mil, and I'm going to split it into 2 pours. The first one coming at about 45 seconds, just going in slow, gentle circles there. And then the second pour, I'm going to pour at about the 90-second mark. The total draw time should be somewhere, 3 to 4 minutes. It might be as low as 2.5 minutes. And more or less, that's your starting line. Now, I'll leave those guidelines down below, but it really is more of a reference point for where you're going to start, because the brew is going to tell you a couple things before you even taste the cup of coffee. Now, while we're waiting for this to brew, I want to talk to you for a minute about coffee and today's sponsor, which is Trade Coffee. Now, the coffee that I'm brewing today is this one. It's from Dune Coffee Roasters. It was grown by Alexander Vargas in Colombia, and it is a natural processed red striped bourbon. Delicious coffee, and it came to me from Trade. One thing about pour over, it's probably the most bean forward brew method that there is. You can dial everything in perfectly from a brew standpoint, and if the bean isn't fresh or the coffee isn't great, your finished cup of coffee is going to fall flat. So having really good freshly roasted beans in your brewer is going to be far and away the biggest thing that you can do to improve your brews ahead of any of the levers we're going to talk about. Now, Trade has been doing this for over a decade. They've built relationships with over 50 really great coffee roasters. And their team of Q-graders and baristas have curated over 500 different coffees that are available through those different roasters. You take a quiz online, and then they match you to different coffees based on your actual taste preferences. And then those coffees are roasted to order and shipped right to your door. You get great pricing, and the actual quality of the coffees are cafe level for sure. And if your first bag isn't quite right, they replace it for free. That's their first bag guarantee. And right now, Trade is offering up to 30% off new coffee subscriptions at drinktrade.com/daddygotcoffee. That's drinktrade.com/daddygotcoffee to get up to 30% off your first subscription. So let's get back to the brew here. It finished out at just around 3 minutes. And there are 2 moments in every brew that are going to give you some direct feedback just by watching what is happening in here. The first one is the bloom. Now, there are a couple things that you can see when you're blooming your coffee. The first thing you might see is this big kind of puff up, these bubbles coming up in your bloom. And that's a sign of a lot of CO2 actually coming out of the coffee that was introduced during the roasting process. And when you see that, it can often be a sign that the coffee is very fresh. And in that case, you really don't want to rush the bloom. You want to give it a little bit of extra space. Now, on the other hand, you may do your bloom, your little bit of water there, and you may actually see not a lot going on. It may just kind of sit there and kind of hang out and be like shallow in and drain through relatively quickly. And that can often be a sign that the coffee is maybe a little bit older. And in cases like that, you can definitely do a short bloom. So even based on that, we can start to adjust the bloom in order to give us the extraction that we need later on in the brew. The second signal is the drawdown time. And like I said, you want that to be between, 3 to 4 minutes in a lot of cases, including the bloom. And by drawdown, I mean by the time you see the water kind of disappear into those grounds. You can push that shorter or longer, but if it's draining in like 90 seconds, that's a very short contact time. The extraction will be light. It may come out tasting a little hollow or sharp without a lot of sweetness or good stuff in your cup of coffee. Now, on the flip side, if you're like way over 4 minutes, like 5 minutes, and the coffee just is not draining through this thing, it's very likely that really small particles inside your grind called fines have migrated down into the filter and are actually clogging the coffee that comes through. Now, you can use different levers to actually solve either of those issues, but just be watching for that as a bit of a feedback loop to be giving yourself information about your brew. But of course, you do also want to rely on taste. So let's see how this one came out. That is tasting really good, and I'm actually quite happy with that. We're still going to talk about each one of those 5 levers and how it pertains to optimizing if it doesn't happen to go well. And the first lever that is actually very intuitive to adjust is your grind size. A finer grind will slow down that brew and will pull more out of the coffee, and a coarser grind will speed up the brew and pull out a little bit less. And that's just pure mechanics. If you have really tiny particles, it's a lot easier for the water to get all of the chemical compounds out of it, versus if you have a big chunk of coffee, the water's got to work a little bit harder to get the stuff out of it. Makes sense. But what gets talked about a lot less when it comes to grind size is the body and clarity dimension. Those little tiny dusty particles called fines extract very aggressively, and coarser grinds minimize them. Now, those particles can actually add a lot of body and texture with what they contribute to the slurry. So with fewer fines, you get a brighter, clearer cup, and with more fines, more weight, body, and texture. If you go too far though, you can get muddiness and bitterness even when the extraction looks good on paper. For me, grind size can be as much a body and clarity dial as it can be an extraction dial, and those things don't always move together, so you need to look at some other levers to pull. And the next one is ratio. How much water are we using in comparison to how much coffee? 1 to 16 is pretty standard when it comes to pour over, but anything really like 1 to 14 to 1 to 18 can give you really great results in the cup. A higher ratio can very often give you a lighter and cleaner cup, particularly with coffees that are harder to extract. We'll get more to that in a minute. Higher ratios can often give you more clarity and nuance, letting some of that acidity and aromatics really come forward in the cup, particularly with coffees that can be harder to extract. Lower ratios tend to give you more body and intensity. The character shift across that range can be a lot bigger than most people expect, so it is something worth playing with. Next lever is water temperature. And again, you got a big range here in what people tend to do and what is usable when it comes to pour over. You can start as low as like 85 degrees Celsius all the way up to near boiling. Now, you might think higher temp will extract more, which, that can be true, but it also is as much of a flavor dial as it is an extraction tuning variable. And water that's too hot can actually drive off some of those volatile aromatics that are really nice to get in the cup. When you see some of those floral or very fruity notes, those compounds can be very sensitive, and water that's too hot can drive them right off your coffee slurry before they even end up in your cup. You may actually have experienced this if you're doing a pour over and it smells amazing, but then when you actually go and drink it, it feels like it doesn't really measure up to what you were getting while you were brewing. If you run into that, try dropping your temp a little bit. Also, if you drop the temp a little bit on darker roasts, you're going to be selecting against some of those more bitter compounds and result in a sweeter, more balanced cup. So on the whole, we've seen this shift go from like, oh, you want to go as hot as possible, generally actually tending to swing a little bit lower recently, but it is something that you can play with. The fourth lever that we're going to talk about is the bloom. And in some ways, this is the more underused variables, especially with higher end coffees. What the bloom does is it sets the stage for a good and even extraction for the main part of the brew. The CO2 that is introduced to the coffee during the roasting process can actually block the extraction process. And if you just pour in a big old pour of water and you have a dry clump of grounds sitting there, it's just not going to extract as evenly as some of the more saturated coffees. A bloom allows you to get an even saturation before you get to the main extraction. For very light or complex coffees, this can actually make a big difference because those very sensitive compounds that can get lost or driven off can actually get further impacted due to channeling in your brew or an uneven extraction. We'll talk more about this in a minute, but a long bloom on some of those coffees to really ensure a even and thorough saturation can really help you get the most out of some of those coffees. With dark roasts, though, you don't necessarily need to go to that same extreme. They are a little bit more soluble by nature, which means you can get away with a shorter bloom, 20, 30 seconds, and then move on. And the fifth lever that we're going to talk about, which in my opinion is maybe the one that puts the most amount of control into your hands, period, is agitation. And this is something that really gets overlooked when people are talking and sharing different recipes, both in terms of pour technique and recipe structure. A very high, very fast, or high volume, very turbulent pour will really mix and churn up the coffee slurry. That will increase extraction and promote evenness in the brew, but it has a flip side as well. When you do that, the fines, the really dusty particles in there, will also move around a lot more easily, and then they can migrate more quickly to the filter walls and cause your brew to stall out. So if you're consistently ending up with brews that are stalling and you can't figure out why, it's very likely due to agitation. Now, there are a couple things that you can do to minimize agitation. Number one, you can pour from a lower height or slower. You can get one of these things called a mellow drip, which allows you to create more of a gentle shower across your brew as well. That will really reduce agitation. Also, the number of pours that you have in your recipe have a big impact when it comes to agitation, because every pour is a subsequent remixing and redistributing of that coffee. If you do more pours, you're going to get more body, less clarity, higher chance of stalling. Fewer pours, lower agitation, generally a little bit higher clarity, and reduced chance of stalling. So you can actually pull that agitation lever in two different ways. You can do it either with the way you're pouring or with the structure of your recipe. Now, before we move on and talk about how to synthesize all these levers into one pour over system, there are a couple other things that you want to consider. And the first one is your actual dripper geometry. Is it a conical or is it a flat bottom dripper? And which geometry it has will affect everything that we've discussed so far. Conical drippers funnel all the water down to a single exit point at the bottom here. Also, drippers like the V60 and any modeled similarly have a lot more chance for water to bypass around the majority of the coffee bed because of the way these ribs are here. Also, the coffee bed is kind of this irregular shape. All of those things result in your pour technique actually having an outsized impact on the result that you have in your cup. They can be a little harder to use. Flatbed brewers like the Kalita Wave or an Oria have a layer of coffee at the bottom of the dripper because of the flat bed that is all a uniform depth. That makes them more resilient and forgiving, but generally you get a little bit more body and less clarity and nuance in your cup because all of the water is going through that bed and the overall structure of the dripper. Generally though, all of the levers that you have access to will function in more or less the same way. Filters and coffee grinders are another thing that you want to consider. You know, you may be adjusting your grind and your drawdown is the same no matter what you do. It may actually be because your filter has a throughput level that you're not able to get past. You know, a Hario tabbed filter will flow generally a lot more slowly than a filter like a Cafec T90 or something like that. I tend to prefer the Cafec Abaca filters. I find they produce a really nice cup, but it is worth doing a little bit of Googling to see if the filter you're using is a high flow or a slow flow filter, because if it is flowing a little bit more slowly, again, that can make for a more forgiving brew, but it does take a little bit of control of some of those levers out of your hands. You know, not necessarily better or worse, just different. And grinders function very similarly. Every grinder has a different, it's called particle size distribution. You know, it will produce some coffee particles that are the exact grind size that it's set to, and it's also likely to produce maybe some larger particles as well as what we call fines, those little dusty particles. And different grinders will produce these different size particles in different proportions. Grinders that have a very wide particle distribution, grinders like the Niche Zero, which is a conical grinder, they will produce a lot of fines, which is great for espresso actually, but can really lower the ceiling for agitation when you're doing pour over. So if you're using a grinder like that, you really want to do everything you can to minimize agitation in the brew. Or you may have a flat burr grinder that is very uniform. It's kind of got a particle distribution that is locked in on that grind size, and that will allow you a lot more control to mess with the agitation in different ways. Again, not that you need to go out and get a different grinder, but just being aware of where your grinder sits in that spectrum can help inform the best approach for your coffee brewing. Okay, so back to the coffee that you started with and the recipe that you found on Reddit that didn't work at all for you. Before you ever touch a kettle or a dripper or whatever, it's very helpful to actually look at your bag of coffee and start building a picture of how you might want to approach it. Roast level has a big impact on how a coffee will actually brew. And unfortunately, what some roasters call dark is what other roasters call light. So this can be really hard until you kind of look at a lot of different coffees and make your own judgment as to where it sits. If it's a lighter roasted coffee, that means it's less soluble or more difficult to extract. If it's a darker roasted coffee, that means it's more soluble and easier to extract. So for coffees that are easier to extract, you want to do fewer things to push that extraction level higher. With coffees that are harder to extract, you want to do more things to increase the extraction. It could be more agitation, a longer bloom, or with the darker roasted coffees, less agitation, fewer pours, and shorter blooms. Process also has an impact. Washed processed coffees tend to be the least soluble. So often you might want to add a little bit of agitation or maybe a slightly longer bloom or extend the ratio a little. So if this was a washed processed coffee, I may have pushed the bloom a little bit longer. Anaerobics and heavily fermented coffees tend to be the most soluble, and that can really go sideways if you start doing things to push the extraction in ways that you shouldn't. And same with decaffeinated coffees, actually. Altitude is another one. Generally speaking, higher altitude coffees are denser and less soluble, and lower altitude coffees tend to be less dense and more soluble. So again, that can inform some things on how you're going to approach them in terms of ratio, bloom, agitation, water temperature, and so on. And lastly, you have freshness. Now, in my experience, you don't want to brew coffees, especially nice coffees that are too fresh. You want to give them, a couple weeks at least to breathe off roast, to let some of that off-gassing happen naturally. Then you get into the sweet spot for brewing, where you want to kind of treat it normally. But then if it gets past its prime and you start noticing, oh, the bloom doesn't, bubble as much, or it seems flatter or whatever, you can actually tighten up that bloom and end up squeaking out a little bit more of your coffee. So where this really gets interesting is you're reading off several of these factors and using them to build a picture of how you're going to structure your brew. So you may treat a low altitude Brazilian natural coffee a lot different than you would a high altitude Ethiopian wash process coffee. The Brazilian, you may want to go with a slightly shorter ratio, shorter bloom, less agitation. The high altitude Ethiopian coffee, which is less soluble, you're going to want to be pushing more. Don't go to boiling water to drive off the aromatics that are really nice with those coffees. But you can extend the ratio a little, maybe do a little bit longer of a bloom, maybe do an extra pour, maybe even do a double bloom, that type of thing. Now, as you're learning how to adjust these 5 different levers and build them into a system that works for any coffee, and this does get very intuitive over time, before you go changing everything, try and get to a place where you're able to brew consistently first. Then from there, try changing one of those levers and see what the impact in your cup is. Once that actually clicks and you understand the taste difference that each of those 5 levers have, you'll actually find it a lot more rewarding to just make up your own recipe on the spot that is tuned for a specific coffee rather than using somebody else's that you found on the internet. Now, I want to know your top tip for somebody learning to make the most of their pour overs. Make sure you drop it in the comments. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you on the next one.